Morning we will not, I hope it goes without saying, be equating disobedience with sin. But if you grew up in a religiously conservative environment, that might be the first thing that comes to mind. According to some traditions, there are certain timeless rules that you must follow, and if you don't, then God will be mad at you, right? And if you grew up in a context like that, I wouldn't be surprised if you've had a nagging sense of guilt for much of your life. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Because whatever the rules are, you know you've broken them. And you probably had fun doing it, so you're doubly guilty. Anybody know about that? Yes. Here at First Unitarian, however, you sit at the head of a historical lineage that is marked by disobedience, or as our ancestors' critics thought of it, heresy. Of course, our ancestors, who in some cases lost their lives for their nonconformity, thought of their heresies quite in the opposite way, as obedience to the higher powers of love, reason, and conscience. So this is by no means a sermon on disobedience that is secretly meant to convince you to be obedient, at least not in the way your grandmother's minister would have taught. And we're not just going to talk about disobedience of religious or ultimate rules, but also about disobeying civil rules, civil disobedience, which is gaining in power and popularity again recently. However, it seems obvious to me when preaching on disobedience to start first with the Bible, because, let me tell you, it is chock full of punks and troublemakers. Liars, rogues, thieves, women who were either too strong or too loose for their time, or both, and weak or violent men, or both. If you want stories of scandal and outrage, lasciviousness and treachery, look no further than the Bible. It's ironic, actually, that the Bible could be thought of as something that people should somehow obey when it is itself brimming with disobedience, not to mention contradictions. The story of creation is just barely completed in the book of Genesis when what happens in the Garden of Eden? Okay. The apple, right? Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit. God says, in essence, this is your paradise. There's only one thing you aren't allowed to do, and that is to eat from the tree of knowledge. And then the serpent shows up and urges Eve to eat the fruit. If you eat it, it will make you wise, he tells her. That sounds good, and so she does. And she offers some to Adam, who doesn't seem to give it any thought at all before he takes a big bite, too. In the 4th century, the theologian Augustine called Eve and Adam's disobedience the original sin and said that we have all, every one of us, inherited it. We're all born sinners. Naturally, many have taken that assertion very literally, and some theologians have gone so far as to speculate about how sin might be passed genetically through the man's seed. But rather than thinking about and describing such intricacies, which, by the way, is a curious fascination of religious people since time immemorial, I think it's more useful to consider the significance of the argument that disobedience is the sin inherent to humankind. Augustine, by the way, was famous for his misbehavior. He was quite the ladies' man as a young person. It was during that time that he uttered his famous prayer, "God, grant me chastity and continence, but not yet." Mañana. What does it mean that our most ancient myths show humans as inherently, tragically disobedient? What does it mean to say that disobedience is the original sin? After the creation story in the Bible, we have the book of Exodus, in which the Pharaoh of Egypt refuses to obey God, despite plagues of frog, lice, locusts, boils, and worse. It isn't until the 10th plague touches down that the Pharaoh finally relents and obeys. And even then, after he liberates the Israelites, he turns around and chases them to the Red Sea, which has opened to let them pass, and it closes on the Pharaoh's troops. Later, King David commits adultery and murder, both in violation of the Ten Commandments. According to the story, David was chosen by God to be king and would be the ancestor of Jesus, but even he was disobedient. And in another book of the Bible, God tells a man named Jonah to go and be a prophet in Nineveh. But Jonah, knowing how people usually treat prophets, runs in the opposite direction and catches the next boat out of there. He's like, forget it, and he just takes off. Then what happens? He gets swallowed by a whale. That's the Jonah and the whale story. One of my cousins, a former Pentecostal music minister, wrote a beautiful song about straying from the right path in your life and getting swallowed up by your mistakes. Take my life from the belly of the whale, take my life. My whole life is a whale of a tale, take my life. We all know people who've been swallowed up in this metaphorical way. Maybe you've been swallowed up at some point in your life and you've found your way out. Or maybe you feel you are in the belly of a whale today, a dark, preposterous place that you never imagined you would find yourself, and you're here looking for the light. If so, then if there's anything that moves the heart and lifts the spirit here this morning, it is especially for you. Even Paul, arguably the most important founder of Christianity after Jesus, alludes to how hard it is to be obedient. In a letter he wrote to one of the early churches, he said, "I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, 'You shall not covet.' But sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness." Sin, seizing an opportunity, produced in me covetousness. Paul was writing to a religious community that faced the same challenge any congregation faces, that religion is ultimately human-made, not divinely made, however divine its object. It therefore is destined to fall short of its own ideals because it ultimately depends upon humans, wayward, conflicted, frail, imperfect humans. Paul says to his people, every one of us is familiar with the fact that if you sin, you will suffer, and yet everyone is doing these things. Therefore, no one should judge another. When there's something you know you're not supposed to do, why is it so tempting to do it? Or so I'm told. But then Paul says something really radical. He basically says, forget the laws. It's more important to know the nature of the God with whom we're dealing, and that God is love. This is an interesting trajectory in human history, at least from the religiously liberal perspective. We've gone from understanding God in terms of specific rules to understanding God as love. We've gone from understanding ourselves as rule breakers who may be punished by a paternalistic God, to understanding ourselves as accountable, ultimately, not to a rule book writer, but to love. And the only freedom love denies us is the freedom to destroy ourselves. Now, there are lots of ways to destroy ourselves. If you're a human being, you've dabbled in some of them. We all have. Whether it's drinking too much or being obsessed with money, harming others or being harmed in our relationships, or both. Letting addiction unravel our lives, comparing ourselves to impossible media-created images of what a beautiful or happy person is like, and loathing ourselves as a result. Working too much, or withholding our love from others, or fill in the blank. There are lots of ways to violate the love rule, and frankly, I don't even think we've thought of them all. Just when we thought nuclear weapons were it, biological warfare stepped it up a notch. That's the wisdom of the creation story, that we are our own worst enemies sometimes, and that this is an inherent, if not inherited, part of being human. The reason for it is that we are born to be free. We're born to be free even if it means we make bad decisions sometimes. Eating the forbidden fruit will make you wise, the serpent told Eve. The serpent was right. Our mistakes have a lot to teach us. It's never too late to go back and learn, or to learn more from something we regret. But it sure can take courage. This is not a church that requires obedience to a whole bunch of strict rules, but it doesn't mean that we are invited to do whatever we want either. We are accountable to love. Now here's where we move into an interesting truth. Sometimes, in order to avoid destroying ourselves, love requires us to disobey a lower law. Sometimes love requires us to disobey a lower law. I'm talking now about civil disobedience. Gandhi's Indian independence movement was an example of love requiring disobedience. So was the civil rights movement, the work of Martin Luther King Jr. And so was the farm worker rights movement. But let me tell you, if their qualities as movements and the effect of civil disobedience seemed pretty clear to me when I set out to write this, when I started my research, I realized immediately that I was just barely going to scratch the surface of the vast amount of theorizing that has been done on this topic. There is a lot of writing out there about civil disobedience, and not all of it is accountable to that higher law of love. So what I'm going to do is touch on some of the big questions briefly, and then tell you about a fairly recent example of disobedience, civil disobedience, that I think illustrates some of the good points. There are big questions about whether civil disobedience should take the form of passive resistance or something more active. Whether it must always be nonviolent. Whether one person can do it alone, in private, or whether it must be collective and public to count. Whether it should be judged by its outward effect or whether the integrity of the person doing it is the most important part. This last part about collective versus solitary and effective versus privately meaningful has some roots right in our own UU history. Henry David Thoreau was brought up as a Unitarian at the First Parish in Concord, Massachusetts, where almost 200 years later I was a ministerial intern and where they instructed me in the correct pronunciation of his name, Thoreau, before they even offered me the position. I had not even mentioned him. Thoreau publicly renounced his membership from First Parish as an adult, but he went on to have a huge influence on our faith with his writings about nature and transcendentalism. Those were the topics of the book that made him very famous, Walden. And they are great topics for another sermon, so if you don't know what transcendentalism is, don't worry. We'll get back to it sometime later. But Thoreau also wrote an essay that's very relevant to this sermon. It was originally entitled Resistance to Civil Government, and later became known as Civil Disobedience. In that work, he decried the injustice of slavery, which was at its horrifying height then, and the Mexican-American War, which he saw as an attempt to steal land from Mexico. This land, as a matter of fact. Thoreau argued that citizens are morally responsible if they support an unjust government, even if their support is required by law. He wrote, "If the injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, let it go. But if it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see, at any rate, that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn." And so he says he stopped paying his taxes. He even went to jail for it. He wasn't famous yet, though, and so no one even really noticed what he had done. In Thoreau's case, this civil disobedience was private when it happened. Later, when he had become a well-known writer and thinker, his essay influenced Gandhi. By imprisoning him, the government had locked up his body, but not his conscience. The government may have brute strength, he noted, but not superior wit. In true disobedient style, he said, "I was not born to be forced. I will breathe after my own fashion. Let us see who is the strongest." As a side note, I've known children who seem to be born with those words upon their tiny lips, and almost always girls. I can't help that this quality will serve them well, but for heaven's sake, let's teach them to use it well. Teach them to love justice. As for the other big questions about civil disobedience, it's hard for me to imagine any situation in which violence could be in service to love. I would think the exceptions to this are so rare that we can scarcely find them in human history. There are almost always better options. And in terms of passive versus active resistance, as in whether to sit down at the lunch counter and politely refuse to get up until you are arrested without resisting, or whether to intentionally disrupt Congress so it can't pass a morally abhorrent law, I'll say that passive resistance lends itself better to public sympathy. But here's a story about someone who was active and who I think accomplished something very good. In the last hours of 2008, the Bush administration tried to offer the oil and gas industry a quick and dirty parting gift. Without the legally required environmental reviews, Bush's Bureau of Land Management put drilling rights to thousands of acres of federal land on the auction block. Much of it was near Utah's national parks. Because they circumvented the legal process, there wasn't time for formal objections, and a lot was at stake. Tim DeChristopher, who was 27 years old and a student at the University of Utah, saw his fellow environmentalists protesting outside the federal building and decided to take it to another level by entering. He planned to make a speech or otherwise somehow be disruptive and get himself arrested. Instead, when he walked in, the person at the desk asked him if he was there to bid. And on the spur of the moment, he said yes. Auction paddle in hand, he entered and, despite having no money, proceeded to place winning bids on more than 22,000 acres of land. Worth $1.8 million before he was stopped by a federal official. Now, obviously, he did not get to keep the rights to the land, but he did manage to buy enough time for other environmentalists to file an injunction against the sale. When all was said and done, out of the 116 leases the administration was offering, only 26 were found to be legal. An article in the Huffington Post last summer pointed out that improper oil operations can have disastrous consequences. Last summer, an ExxonMobil pipeline spilled over 50,000 gallons of oil into the Yellowstone River. And the article argued that DeChristopher's actions might have saved 2 national parks from a similar fate. Naturally, the federal government was not amused. The prosecutor decided to make an example out of him and charged him with 2 felonies, and he's now serving a 2-year sentence in federal prison. Civil disobedience, by definition, involves breaking a law, and when we engage in it, we have to be willing to suffer the consequences. DeChristopher clearly was. At his sentencing hearing, he delivered a calm, thoughtful statement to the judge. He pointed out the hypocrisy of a federal government that would incarcerate a student activist for meddling with an auction while letting the CEO of Massey Energy remain free. Massey Energy has been cited for over 62,000 violations in the last decade and is, as you will recall, responsible for the deaths of 29 minors. I'm going to read you a section from his closing comments. I'm not saying any of this to ask you for mercy, he said, but to ask you to join me. If you side with the prosecuting attorney and believe that your role is to discourage citizens from holding their government accountable, then you should follow his recommendations and lock me away. I certainly don't want that. I want you to join me in standing up for the right and responsibility of citizens to challenge their government. I want you to join me in valuing this country's rich history of nonviolent civil disobedience. If you share those values but think my tactics are mistaken, you can sentence me to a wide range of community service efforts that would point my commitment down a different path. You can steer that commitment if you agree with it, but you can't kill it. This is not going away, he said. At this point of unimaginable threats on the horizon, this is what hope looks like. In these times of a morally bankrupt government that has sold out its principles, this is what patriotism looks like. With countless lives on the line, this is what love looks like, and it will only grow. You can applaud to Christopher. Yeah. I'm going to close by paraphrasing those words of Frederick Buechner that you heard earlier this morning. To obey the law of the land leaves you with your constitutional freedom, but not the freedom to follow your own conscience. To obey the dictates of your own conscience leaves you freedom from moral guilt, but not the freedom to gratify your strongest appetites. To obey your appetites leaves you the freedom of an animal to take what you want, but not the freedom to be fully human. But to obey love itself, which above else wishes us well, leaves us the freedom to be the best and gladdest that we have it in us to become. The only freedom love denies us is the freedom to destroy ourselves. May we carry that in our hearts and let it guide our lives going forward. So may it be.